Without further ado, I'd like to hand my virtual mic over to Devin Naar.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure and great opportunity for me to be here with you to share a little bit about Greek Jewish history, and also very pleased to share the virtual stage with Jane. So thank you for this opportunity. I'd like to begin with a personal anecdote, which brings me back to my college years, at which point I was serving as a representative of the student body at a community-wide Holocaust commemoration program. And I was interacting with some of the other participants and organizers sort of backstage before the program began. And one of the organizers asked me, what my relationship was to the Holocaust and why I was there. And I explained that my grandfather's brother and his family were murdered in Auschwitz. And she asked me, where was your family from? And I said, Salonica, in Greece. And she paused. She looked at me for a moment, and then she responded, she said, that can't be. I'm a survivor of Auschwitz, and I never met a Jew from Greece. And that was a really startling moment for me. It was a kind of unexpected, unintended form of Holocaust denial almost. Here I was, a young student, there to commemorate the Holocaust, being told by the organizers that my family's Holocaust story is not part of the story. I wish I had known then what I know now, which is that precisely at the time that I was in college participating in that Holocaust commemoration program, there was another program that was taking place at Auschwitz itself, which was the installation and unveiling of a new plaque, a memorial plaque. Since the 1960s, plaques in all of the languages of the victims of the Holocaust had been inaugurated there, except for one language. And that language was the Judeo-Spanish language, the Ladino language of the Sephardic Jews of Greece and Balkans and Turkey. It actually required years of petitioning on the part of a Ladino speaking Auschwitz survivor himself in the 1990s into 2000 until 2003 to get the language and the plaque represented there at Auschwitz. And the plaque reads in Judeo-Spanish the same way it reads in all the other languages. Que este lugar donde los nazis exterminaron 1,5 millones de hombres, de mujeres y de criaturas, la más parte judíos, de varios países de la Europa, sea para siempre, para la humanidad, un grito de desespero y unas señales. May this place, where the Nazis exterminated 1.5 million men, women, and children, for the most part Jews, from various countries of Europe, may it be forever for humanity, a call of despair and a sign. Why was the organizer of the Holocaust commemoration program in which I participated as a college student virtually unaware of the fate of Greek Jews during the Holocaust? And why did it take 40 years for Auschwitz itself to inaugurate a commemorative plaque in the language of the Sephardic Jews? I think Paul already began to allude to some of the explanation, but it has to do with the way that we think about world society. We live in a Eurocentric world, and it has to do with the way in which we think about the Holocaust, thinking about the victims of occupied Europe, and thinking about what are the boundaries of that story and that experience, thinking about Central Europe and Western Europe and Eastern Europe, but the lands of the former Ottoman Empire in Southeastern Europe, the lands in North Africa, to which Paul alluded before, which were also dramatically impacted by the Nazi regime. The Jews of all of those countries, the Jews of Turkey even, were included in Hitler's final solution. They were included in the Wannsee protocols. They have not been part of that story, and part of it is demographic, sure. There were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe and thousands and thousands of Jews in Southeastern Europe. But part of it is just how we think about the world in the way that we do, with which centers Europe and thinks about everything else as a kind of periphery. But if we don't recognize the vast scope and the lands and communities that were decimated by the Holocaust, we do not grasp the full impact of the Nazi atrocities. This map does not capture that full extent. This is a typical kind of map. It's from the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. You will notice here Salonica is mentioned, but part of Greece is cut off here. The island of Rhodes, which would have been down here, is not even included, let alone parts of North Africa and other places. But, think about the island of Rhodes. The Jews from the island of Rhodes were deported in the summer of 1944, the very end of the war. And it took them 3 weeks to arrive at their place of extermination in Auschwitz, taken by ship to the port of Athens, from Athens to on the train to Salonica, from Salonica up through the Balkans to the heart of German-occupied Poland, to Auschwitz, where just a few thousand Jews were exterminated. It demonstrates the extent of the machinery, the ferocity with which the Nazi regime sought to execute the final solution. The final solution being even more important at this late phase than even winning the war. And if we don't include these seemingly marginal stories, we don't understand the full meaning and scope and destruction of the Holocaust. It is not only the Yiddish language and culture that was decimated, but it was also the Ladino culture and language that was decimated. The Greek language and culture that was decimated of the Romaniote Jews of Greece. Back in college, I began to try to unpack and put together the story of my own family, and that opened up an entire universe into the lost world of the Jews of Greece and the Jews of Salonika. And I began by asking questions of my own family. My grandfather, who's this young boy here, and his parents, my great-grandparents, Benjamin and Rachel. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, a chacham in the Ottoman Empire, and subsequently in Greece and the United States. And they were able to secure visas to get to this country precisely because of a little loophole in American immigration law that exempted clergy members from the strict immigration quotas that were imposed on people coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe, who were deemed by the United States government to be racially inferior, to be undesirable. And it's those same kinds of exclusionary immigration legislation that would prevent some of the other members of my family who did not leave at this time from being able to come to the United States at all. And it prevented thousands and thousands, countless Jews, not only from Greece, but all across Nazi-occupied Europe, from entering the country. And we live with the legacies of those laws still today in the headlines. It is through encountering the stories from my own family that I began to unpack the experience of the lost branch. My great-uncle Salomon, who's not pictured here, he did not embark on that trip to the United States with the rest of the family, even though he had previously been in the United States. But he had returned to Greece, and by the time it became clear that life in Greece was no longer opportune and ideal, he could not secure a visa, and for nearly 15 years he sought to secure a visa. But because of those quotas, because of his status as undesirable, because of the perceptions by the U.S. government of his racial inferiority as a Jew coming from Southeastern Europe, coming from the former Ottoman Empire, coming from the Muslim world, he was denied that admission. One of my great uncles eventually gave me a stack of letters. Here's one of them. And he said, look, these letters will tell you the story. And I remember thinking, what is going on? I cannot make heads or tails out of this other than the date and the place. It says Thessaloniki, Salonica, and the date, November 1945. And I said, Uncle Leon, what language is this written in? And he says, it's Spanish. I said, Spanish? You got to be kidding me. He says, no, this is how we wrote our Spanish, Ladino, the Sephardic Spanish, which, like Yiddish, is historically written in Hebrew letters, but the Sephardic style of the Hebrew script, which is now defunct, and it is almost completely lost. I was eventually able to find in an old book a chart of Sephardic Hebrew script that said this little squiggly mark corresponds to this modern Israeli, which is actually Ashkenazi Hebrew script. And I remember going through it, and the first word I could decipher was this one. If anybody knows Hebrew, maybe you'll try to figure it out. Do you know what this says? That first letter. You might say it's a lamed. It's not a lamed. It's an aleph, which is very much like the Arabic alif. And you can see already, even in the way that the Jews of the Ottoman Empire wrote the language, the Hebrew alphabet, the influence of the broader Muslim culture. This is the word Almanes, Germans. And I figured if I could decipher this text, I might be able to figure out what happened to my great uncle and his family. And the letter begins like this. It was written by a family friend who survived the war. Wrote to my great-grandfather, Chacham Ben Yamin, who was already in the United States. Muy caro Chacham Ben Yamin. Puede ser que se va a maravillar de recibir novedades de mi parte. Yo tenía intención de escribirle desde mucho tiempo, ma non tenía gana de verme a mí. Non quise amargarlo a él también. Veramente non sé cuál decirle en esta letra. Estoy tanto harvado y triste que me hace mucho mal de recontar la tragedia muy fuerte que se abatió sobre nosotros. The story of the Jews of Greece and the story of its demographic, cultural capital of Salonika is a story that we should know. If we go to Salonika 100 years ago, we will find a thriving Jewish community in the context of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and multi-linguistic Ottoman Empire. What was special about Salonika, among its many features, was that more than half of its city's multicultural residents were Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. The impact and influence of the Jews of Salonika was so vast that the city even closed on the Sabbath in observance of the Jewish day of rest, from Friday night to Saturday night. The port, the most important port in the entire Balkans, vast center of import and export and trade, closed. It was, in effect, a Jewish city under Muslim suzerainty. It was known as the Shabbatopolis, the city of the Sabbath. It was known as the Jerusalem of the Balkans. It was known as Ir V'Em B'Yisrael, city and mother of Israel. La Madre de Israel, in which Jews could be found in all socioeconomic strata. And this was typical for Jews of Greece. There were merchants and bankers, but there were also fishermen and port workers, factory workers, pumpkin seed sellers, lemonade vendors, gangsters, prostitutes. It was a full-range Jewish society, so much so that even important Zionist figures like David Ben-Gurion, who visited the city in 1911, referred to it as a Hebrew labor city, the only one in the world. And it's true, it was one of the only places in which Jews could be found without any exclusions in the social and economic fabric of the city. But the dynamics in the city would be irrevocably transformed on the eve of World War I, which was preceded by another series of wars known as the Balkan Wars, which were essentially fought over who was going to gain control of this most coveted Balkan port city of Salonika. The Greek army was victorious and annexed the city. The Ottomans surrendered. And a new chapter in the history of the Jews of Salonika and in the history of the Jews of Greece would be inaugurated. Suddenly, the Greek state, which was a relatively small state and had a relatively small Jewish population, would now have within its territories one of the largest Jewish communities in the world and the largest of the Ladino-speaking Jewish communities to ever exist on the face of the earth. Could Jews who spoke Ladino, practiced their own religion, had their own institutions and communal dynamics, could they find a place for themselves in Greece? Would it be possible? The same question that was asked elsewhere in Europe at this time, in the era of the nation state. If you do not belong to that dominant nation, if you do not speak the language of the dominant nation, if you do not practice the religion, what will your fate be? Will there be room for you in this nation state? And that was a question that the Jews of Greece grappled with, as Jews all across Europe did at this time. The Great War compounded the dynamics for the Jews of Salonika as a major fire destroyed the center of the city, leaving 70,000 residents homeless, 50,000 of whom were Jews. And here's a representation, an illustration, a recreation of that fire that my own father, who is an artist and painter, recently composed. Jewish schools, nearly 36 synagogues were destroyed. The archives, the city was left in ashes. But the Jewish community persevered, and they began to rebuild. Jewish hospital, schools, Jewish neighborhoods to house the homeless from the fire, orphanages. And they sought to try to imagine a future for themselves as Jews and as Greeks. And we can get a sense of this process and the multiple cultural affinities and allegiances that they displayed in this Rosh Hashanah Jewish New Year's postcard from 1927, 10 years after the fire. And in this postcard, which is for the Meir Aboav Girls' Orphanage, you can see all the different cultural constellations at play. Notice the Jewish New Year's greeting, the Sephardic New Year's greeting, Tisku Leshanim Rabot, may you merit many years, is right there. And then you can see the name of the orphanage in Ladino and Hebrew letters, Orfelinato de Ijas Meir Aboav. And then you can see here the Magen David, the Star of David, with the word Zion, Zion, and the Hebrew year 5687, saying that we are Sephardic, we are Jewish, this is also a Zionist organization. You can see the name in Greek, in big letters at the bottom, saying we are a Greek institution as well. We are also a European institution. They project that with a French language, which was then, like English is today, the universal kind of language. You can see here the city where they are. We have this local sense of rootedness. Thessaloniki, it says. And here you can see on the chalkboard the words for teacher and student written in Greek and in Ladino, in that Sephardic Hebrew cursive that my own family used in their personal correspondence, that Sephardic Hebrew cursive, which is known as solitreo. And here you can see the teacher pointing to a map of Greece and the Balkans with her ruler fixed right on their location, Thessaloniki. The argument of this postcard is that we as Jews, we can be all of these things at the same time. We can be Jewish and specifically Sephardic. We can be Jewish and specifically Sephardic, and we can be Zionist. We can be Jewish and specifically Sephardic and Zionist, but also Greek. We can be Jewish, specifically Sephardic and Zionist and Greek, and we can also be part of the project of Europe. In the sense that there was a future for Jews in Greece, despite the vast fire that devastated the city during the World War, despite rising anti-Semitism and economic strife in the context of the Great Depression. And this is most manifest in a very curious way. When, after the World War, the Second World War has already begun, the Jewish community of Salonika does something unusual. They publish a brand new prayer book to be used by Jewish students attending schools all throughout the city. Sidur Sha'arei Tefillah. Look, the war had already begun in 1939. What are they doing in 1941? In the height of the war, publishing a brand new prayer book for the Jewish youth. Their argument is we have a future in our city and in our country. And we, as Jews, who are still observant and religious, in the case of the authors of this prayer book, can also be part of Greece. And they dedicated this prayer book to a Jewish man who had died on the battlefield defending Greece against the Italian invasion. And this is really remarkable. And it says here, En memoria del siempre regretado Shabbatai Henri Rafael Angel, caído en el campo de batalla por nuestra querida patria la Grecia. It says, in memory of the always mourned Shabbatai Henry Raphael Angel, who fell on the battlefield for our beloved homeland, La Grecia, for our beloved homeland, a sense that as Jews, still using the Ladino language, writing it in the Hebrew letters, they could feel a sense of connection and dedication and loyalty to their state, and that they should project that sense of connection to their own community. They don't write it in Greek, by the way. It is not just PR to the state or to their Christian neighbors. It is to tell themselves that they belong. The war against Italy was short-lived, and Greece actually won. But that resulted in Hitler sending in his own forces that resulted in the conquest of Greece. And here you can see the map of Greece, divided into 3 zones of occupation. The Germans took that central northern part there, which had the largest Jewish population. Most of the country's Jews lived in Salonica. The southern part was occupied by the Italians, and the northeastern part was occupied by the Bulgarians. It's interesting, Kastoria, I do not see Kastoria on the map here, but you'll hear a little bit more about that later on. We cannot talk about all of the different experiences that the various Jewish communities underwent during the German occupation. I should only add here that in that green zone of northeastern Greece, which was under direct Bulgarian occupation, all the Jews of Bulgarian-occupied Greece, over 12,000, were deported not by the Germans, but by the Bulgarian police directly to their deaths at Treblinka. And there were virtually no survivors. You can see the beginnings of the reconnaissance of the German occupation forces already in 1941. In April of that year, the German occupation forces would arrive in Salonika, and they would begin to assemble information. And you can see here's a statistic about the different numbers of Jews in the various cities. The Jewish population of Salonika had been about 80 or 90,000 at the beginning of the 20th century, but due to the transition to Greek rule, the fire, and some other factors, many left, including parts of my own family, as I mentioned. And there were probably about less than 100,000 Jews in all of Greece by this time, 80,000 probably. The numbers are difficult to come by. And initially, there were no immediately overt anti-Jewish measures that were implemented in the city. The first measure of great detriment would come in the summer of 1942, at which point young Jewish men were convened in the central square, ironically called Liberty Square, which, by the way, in 1908, the Ottomans had launched a revolution and established a new constitution from Salonika itself. Now, 3 decades later, was being used as a site of the revocation of liberty and the revocation of rights, as Jewish men were rounded up and sent out of the city to undertake compulsory labor to work on German munitions and mines on the railroad. And what's very interesting here, and what I want to emphasize for you, is the way in which the responses of the local population, everyday people, and the authorities shaped the fate of the Jewish community of Salonika as they shaped the fate of Jews all across German-occupied Europe. And here you can see in this first-hand account from the lawyer of the Jewish community, who himself at the time would go into hiding and recount in writing his first-hand witness account of the events that he saw during the German occupation before he was betrayed and before he was sent to the death camps where he was murdered. But here you can see, notice, the satisfaction of the Aryan Greek population was indeed indescribable. And this would be one of the major themes that will shape the trajectory of the Jews of Greece during the Second World War, the responses of the local population. And the responses of the local population would come to a fore some months later, as the leaders of the city thought about ways that they might take advantage of the German occupation to implement long-standing plans that they had in the city, to transform what had been once an Ottoman and Jewish city into a Greek city, into a Christian city, into a European and modern city. And one of the ways that they sought to do this was by transforming the urban landscape of Salonika. Now, remember that fire that I mentioned in 1917 that had burnt down the center of the city? Well, as a result of that fire, the city expanded well beyond the confines of the historic boundaries of the old city. And by the time of the Second World War, that expanded city at its center was what had been the historic Jewish burial ground of Salonika, with the inaugural building of the of the University of Salonika overlooking it. I'm not just talking about any burial ground here. I'm talking about the largest burial ground in Europe. It had about 350,000 graves, twice as many as that as Krakow, exponentially more than the famous Jewish cemetery in Prague. They dated back to 1492, in some instances the Roman era, 2,000 years when the first Jews set foot in Greece. But due to the expansion of the city, it became the new heart of what was supposed to be a Greek and Christian city, and it was coveted terrain. Already before the war, there was a campaign to try to coerce the Jewish community to cede the land of the cemetery to make way for an expanded university campus. And the Jewish community remained strong enough to resist those efforts. But the German occupation would change that dynamic and alter the trajectory of the urban fabric of the city and the fate of the Jewish cemetery. Just to give you a sense of how vast it is, it was about the size of 80 football fields, American football fields. Huge. You can see here that's the original building of the university. Here's the iconic White Tower of Soronica, which still stands today. And you can see how far out the Jewish cemetery went. And it was under the guise of the German occupation that the leaders of the University of Salonika, the leaders of the city council, the leaders of the Chamber of Commerce, went to the German occupation forces and requested permission to expropriate the Jewish cemetery. And now, if you notice, if you go to Germany today, if you go to Berlin, you'll still see a Jewish cemetery in the center of Berlin. If you go to Eastern Europe, you'll still see Jewish cemeteries in various places. The Nazis were principally concerned with disposing of the Jewish living, not the detritus of the Jewish dead. This is what also helps us understand that it was the initiative of the local population that shaped the fate of the Jewish cemetery and not the concerns of the German occupation forces. For at the end of 1942, the cemetery was destroyed, paid for by the city hall, destroyed by Greek Christian workers with pickaxes and shovels. Tombstones from the Jewish cemetery of Salonika were used for every possible work project you could imagine. To line latrines, to pave streets, to build walls. The courtyard of the National Theater of Northern Greece, built out of Jewish tombstones. The cafeteria floor of the Yacht Club of Salonika, built out of Jewish tombstones. The sea walls of the city reinforced with Jewish tombstones. Churches beautified by Jewish tombstones. And here you can see even a swimming pool created with Jewish tombstones with the inscriptions still visible. And here you can see at the end of the war, the church of the city's patron saint, Demetrius, still filled with tombstones. And if you go to this church today, by the way, you will still see tombstones in the courtyard. And you will see little bits and pieces of marble with Hebrew letter inscriptions all throughout the city. Perhaps most importantly of all, the expanded University of Salonika was built on top of Europe's oldest Jewish cemetery. And if you go to Salonika today, you will find in the largest university campus in the entire Balkans, there are 80,000 students there, With the exception of that one initial building that was overlooking the cemetery that I showed you before, the entire extent of the campus of the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki is built on top of what was once the Jewish cemetery of Salonica. The fate of the Jewish dead would in some ways be a foreboding prelude to the fate of the Jewish living. And the mechanisms that you're probably familiar with about isolation, ghettoization, dispossession that would impact other Jewish communities across German-occupied Europe would also take place in Salonika, as in the other Jewish communities in Greece. And why this photo is so striking to me is because it could really perhaps be anywhere else. You've got in German-occupied Europe, you've got the yellow stars. And this is in one of the ghettos that would be formed in Salonika. And what is so striking to me about this image are the smiles. In other words, the young women there, they do not yet recognize what their fate will be. They do not yet recognize what will be happening to their community. They do not yet recognize what will be happening to them. From the spring until the summer of 1943, nearly 50,000 Jews from Salonika will be deported in 18 train loads from Salonika straight to Auschwitz-Birkenau. About 20 to 25% of the residents of the city of Salonika, the second biggest city in all of Greece, would disappear within a few short months. Their homes would be appropriated by the Greek Christian neighbors in coordination with the Greek government and the German occupation forces. The better you are at collaborating, the better property you might receive. In the family letters, I discovered that my great uncle, Tio Salomon, his wife Esther, and their two children, Benny and Rachel, were deported on one of the very last of the trains to go from Salonika to Auschwitz, because my great uncle, Tio Salomon, had been appointed by the last Jewish institution operating in the city, the Matanot Levionim, the Jewish soup kitchen, to distribute milk and yogurt to the sick and elderly as they boarded the trains. And it's for this reason that Tio Salomon remained among the very last Jews in the city before he and his wife and two children met the same fate of the remainder of their community, as did 6 million Jews across German-occupied Europe. The voyage from Salonika to Auschwitz was a grueling one. It took a week. And here is a poem, it is really a song that was sung in Ottoman style by a survivor from Salonika, a survivor of Auschwitz who composed this song. And think about the motivations for why David Chaim wants to survive. 7 días encerrados en vagones de behemas. Una vez a los 3 días nos quitaban a rear. Madre mía mi querida, ya tuvites el zehut de morirte en tus tierras y no pasates por el Oluc. Padre mío mi querido, ¿quién te lo iba a decir? Que vinieras con tu hermano al crematorio de Auschwitz. Padre y madre, hermano y hermanicas, saliendo todos reyagis, el patrón del mundo, que me envíe salud a mí, que me quite de estos campos, para vos echar Kadish. Why does David Chaim want to survive? It is not so he can go back home. It is not so he can see his family members. It's not so he can see his possessions and his stuff. It is so he can be free to mourn the losses of his beloved family members. So he can say Kaddish. The Jews of Salonika and Greece because they were from the southeastern corner of Europe, because they spoke no Yiddish, because they generally spoke no German, and they certainly spoke no Polish. They were among the most isolated of the prisoners who would find themselves at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it was precisely for this reason that the Nazi command selected Jews from Greece disproportionately to serve in the most gruesome task imaginable in the infrastructure of Auschwitz, which was the Zonder Commando, the group that was responsible for escorting prisoners to the gas chambers, the group that was responsible for disentangling the corpses from the gas chambers and lugging them to the crematoria, to incinerating the corpses and to disposing of the ashes. The Jews of Greece, the Nazi command believed, because they had no common language, would keep the secret with them. But they were able to figure out ways to communicate. And it was the Jews from Greece collaborating with other Jewish prisoners in the Zonder Commando and other parts of the Auschwitz and Birkenau concentration camp complex, death camp complex, were able to orchestrate the one and only uprising in the crematoria. They succeeded in killing a couple of German officers, and they blew up a crematoria. This is in October of 1944, very late in the war. And when they are rounded up to face execution for their uprising, we know from testimonies, legends that circulated about what the Jews of Greece did. They sang. What song did they sing? We are told the Greek national anthem. So how? Why? How could it be? And it's a good question. Maybe to say, look, you think you have us here because we're Jews, but no, we are Greeks also. We are Greeks also, despite the fact when we were being rounded up, our neighbors essentially lifted no finger to aid us. Maybe to say, look, you think we are Jews, but we are also Greeks, but what does that mean? We are humans. The Jews of Greece faced one of the highest mortality rates of any of the Jewish communities in all of Europe, second only to Poland. The Jewish population of Salonika went from 90,000 at the beginning of the 20th century to about 56,000 on the eve of the war, and in the wake of the war, barely 2,000 returned, survived. 60 synagogues destroyed. 20 Jewish institutions largely destroyed or occupied by Greek Christians. The Jerusalem of the Balkans was essentially no more. But there was still a glimmer of hope, and there were some who returned, and they were able to begin to rebuild. And they were able to rebuild in part thanks to support that they received from their brothers and sisters and friends and relatives who had previously emigrated. And this group wedding of survivors in 1945 was actually funded by Salonican and other Greek Jews already living in the United States, especially in New York, through the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, of which my family had been members. And I was able even to find my grandfather and some of my great uncles and aunts on the list of those who contributed to the rebuilding of the Jewish communities of Greece in the wake of the war. And today there still stands a Jewish community in Salonika. They are about 1,000 people in a city of 1 million. And I want to close with one final story. which is that the fate of the Jews of Salonica, and you'll hear a story about Kastoria shortly, was particular to the context and the dynamics that were at play. But other places in Greece, the story played out differently, and I would like to share briefly with you the story of the island of Zakinthos, which had a very small Jewish community of 275 people. It was an island on the western coast of Greece, on the Adriatic side, and these were Greek-speaking Jews. And again, late in the war, in May of 1944, the same time that the German officials are going to the island of Rhodes, they're also on the other side of the country, the island of Zakinthos. And German officials go to the mayor and the archbishop, and they demand a list of all the Jews who reside on the island. And the mayor and the archbishop, they tell the German official they'll collect the names and come back tomorrow. And the German official returns, and the mayor and the archbishop present the German official with a list. The list has only two names: the name of the mayor and the name of the archbishop, as if to say, if you're taking our Jews, you're taking us with you. And what happened? The German officer walked away. And all 275 Jews the night before had been sent up into the mountains to be cared for by the villagers. And all 275 Jews on the island of Zakinthos were saved. I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of my great uncle Salomon and my great aunt Esther and their two children, Benjamin and Rachel, and Ganaden Esten. Thank you.
Devin, thank you so much for a really very powerful presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I would like to open it questions to our attendees. Please add your questions to the chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. And while we're waiting, I think it was interesting that you draw that comparison of Salonica with Zakinthos, and how was there such? It seems like there must have been tremendous hatred in Salonica, especially what they did with the cemetery. It's devastating. I don't know if you want to try to answer that.
Well, I think there were some serious tensions, because here you have a city that, practically speaking, was a Jewish city. I mean, in terms of demographically, in terms of culturally and otherwise. I mean, Christians and Muslims even spoke Ladino in this city to undertake commercial business. I've seen business cards for Greek Christians written in Ladino and Hebrew letters. So the logic of nationalism did not really permit the multiplicities of peoples to live together in this framework. And this is a common phenomenon. You know, the idea of the nation state is one people, one language, one history, one religion, one past, one future. And if you're not part of that, what is your fate? And I think that was part of the tension. It was compounded by some of the local and regional politics. So like what happened in the wake of World War I, in the name of ethnic consolidation, Greece and Turkey were at war with each other, because Greece wanted to conquer a bunch of Turkey, and Turkey wound up expelling the Greek forces. And this was known as the Great Catastrophe on the Greek side, because they lost, and was known as the Turkish War of Independence on the Turkish side, because they won. But how that conflict was ultimately settled is that all of the Muslims living in Greece were expelled and sent to Turkey, and all of the Greek Orthodox Christians were expelled from Turkey and sent to Greece. Whereas their families had lived in those regions for a very long time, they didn't really want to leave. And when the Greek Christians were specifically settled in Salonika to change the demographic makeup of the city, to transform it into a Greek city, it created a lot of tensions, especially between that refugee population, who were at odds also with the Jewish refugee population from the fire, struggling over scarce resources and seeking support of the powers that be. And it was even more complicated. It was many of those Greek Orthodox Christians, they were told, look, you're going to your real homeland. You're going back to Greece. And they said, well, what do you mean back to Greece? I've been living here in Asia Minor for 2,000 years. What do you want me to send me to the other side of the Aegean? I don't want to go there. And they said, no, this is your home. This is your home. And they go there, many of them speaking Turkish, by the way, speaking no Greek at all. And then they go to the city that they're told is their home, and it's filled with Jews speaking Ladino. And this created yet another kind of tension and another kind of problem that was not able to be resolved in the context of the interwar years, in the context of the Great Depression, in the context of economic, political strife.
Thank you so much for that answer. I have a few more questions, that have been coming in. So let me try to share them with you. Were there other Greek islands from which Jews were rescued, like Zakinthos?
Not like Zakinthos.
Okay.
So there were other islands in which they were not rescued, like Crete, Rhodes, which had been an Italian island, but after the war would become part of Greece. They're mostly devastated as well.
Right. No, thank you. Yeah.
And if I could just add one line to that, which is that I think sometimes the argument is made that, if the and this is actually relates to the question that's coming up right now, if the Jews of Salonika, they spoke Greek, they would have been better integrated and the general population would have stood up and protected them. I don't think that that's true, although that's a very common interpretation, because if we look at what happened to a exclusively Greek-speaking Jewish community, the community of Yanina, which was the Romaniote center, that community was decimated. And the local population did not intervene to help out. I think actually speaking Greek for the Jews of Salonika, which the younger generation did, and they did well. My great uncle, he wrote and spoke fluent Greek. His children went to Greek-speaking schools. It actually created further tensions because it blurred the boundaries between who is Jewish and who is not Jewish. There was resentment, actually, that Jews would seek to claim Greekness. The Greek Christians said, no, you cannot be Greek because you're Christian. Greekness is tied to Orthodox Christianity. Don't try to cross that boundary. And I think actually this assimilation did not help. It actually created more tensions.
Wow, that's incredible. Okay, and I have a few more questions here that are coming in, and we still have a few minutes. So there was a couple of questions that came in, and you probably saw them as well, about the current situation, about Ladino speakers in Salonika today, about honoring the Jewish community today, and maybe you could say a word or two about about whatever the Jewish culture in Greece today, and also, I guess, its relationship with the current powers.
Well, I think there was a lot of silence in Thessaloniki and in Greece more generally until really until the 21st century, I guess we could say. In 1997, Greece created, Salonika established its first Holocaust monument, which recognized the murder of the Jews of the city. But there was very little additional efforts to try to come to terms with the past, and certainly almost no effort to come to terms with the role that the local Greek Christian population played in the process of collaboration in the dispossession of the Jews. But I think, in the 21st century, just in the moment in which there was far-right activism resurgent in Greece, like with the Golden Dawn, which some of you might be familiar with, there was also an effort spearheaded by the Jewish community leadership and also by an open-minded mayor of the city, a guy by the name of Boutaris, who together they worked with the university, for example, to create the first commemorative, the first monument at the university. And here's an image of it for you. You can see it. It's in a kind of an obscure place on the university campus, but nonetheless, it is there. It is visible. It has a language, commemorative language in the relevant languages, in English, in Greek, in Hebrew, in French, and also in Judeo-Spanish. But the one thing that it does, it indicates, for the first time really, it acknowledges that the university was built on top of the Jewish burial ground. But it says that it was destroyed by the Germans and their collaborators. Now it's interesting that was a big give on the part of the leadership to add "and their collaborators." That was like revolutionary. People were really upset about it. really upset about it. But even in that acknowledgement, it doesn't really say the full truth. Because of the politics that are played, it's very difficult to speak about these issues even today.
I guess it's probably similar to the situation in Poland or Lithuania where there's these kinds of pressures. Except that in those, each place is got something similar. And here's a question here. We have a bunch of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of them, but here's one that I think is important. They're all important, but here's one that I think we should try to address right now, which is there any evidence of Jewish participation in the resistance movement in Greece?
Yes, there is. So I had just a very short time, relatively speaking. I could give you a series of 20 lectures on this topic. But yes, Jews were, this is one of the ways in which Jews in Greece did survive, was that they joined the resistance. Now, especially in Salonika, there was a very vast working class, working in the factories and in industry in the city. And it was home to the most important socialist movement in the entire, what had been the Ottoman Empire. And eventually the Communist Party of Greece would be founded by Salonican Jews. And so there were Jews who joined the communist resistance. And this is how they survived, fighting guerrilla warfare, essentially, in the mountains and in other places. There were also some Jews who joined the nationalist resistance, but they were less welcome there. What is fascinating is that some of the Jews who joined the communist resistance after the war, after World War II, Greece has its own civil war. The United States, the Marshall Plan, all of that kind of stuff. The U.S., of course, backs the anti-communist forces, and they win. The nationalist forces win. And Jewish communists are declared traitors. And some of them who are, as communists, are, by the way, anti-Zionist, but they are deported to the newly founded state of Israel. They're like, why am I going there? I don't want to go there. So like the founder of the Communist Party of Greece winds up living out the rest of his life in poverty in Holon in Israel.
Wow.
And a few years ago, the Greek state actually passed a new law that restored Greek nationality to those people who are stripped of their nationality and deported to Israel. So some very interesting. So that story is, not yet resolved either.
Wow, it's utterly fascinating. You know what? I want to just take a moment to thank you for a fantastic presentation. So full of information, and now we do have a lot of questions. I'm going to just ask people if you could send the questions to me. I will forward them to, I can forward them to Professor Naar. That's probably the easiest. So send them to me. You should all have my email address. It's prudensky@mjhnyc.org, and